Okay, so as always, we're streaming exclusively through our user community on Facebook, a group that is growing at a steady pace, currently over 9,000 members. So welcome to you. Thank you for joining us today. This is going to be another episode which talks about our Precision Toolset, which is Meyer Sound's turnkey solution all the way from design to deployment that support our loudspeaker products. And that means that today is all going to be about content creation. And that means that without further ado, I would like to announce today's host, Miles Rogers. Are you with us?
Yeah, you got me?
Yes, sir. Excellent. Well, then I will stop sharing my screen and take it away, as they say.
All right. Take over here. All right, you got me, Merlijn?
Yes, sir.
Sweet. Okay. Well, the the first order of business here is a huge thank you to the Meyer Sound education team and the marketing team for allowing this opportunity to talk about cinema. Over this week and next week, we've got 4 cinema-focused discussions. And the goal of these discussions is to provide some insight into the exciting developments that are happening in the world of cinema as it relates to home entertainment right now, excuse me. There is a lot of excellent content being created. And the experience at home can be extremely compelling. The challenge for many dealers and customers alike is wading through the noise to figure out, to make best decisions around the design and implementation of those systems. Whether it's your media room or your private cinema. And so I get a consistent round of questions that these 4 webinars will attempt to address. And we're going to get this thing started today with Brian Long from Skywalker Sound. Brian is a good friend of mine and somebody, who has always inspired me to not only work harder but smarter. And it's these are the relationships that I so appreciate in the world, is having friends and colleagues that push us to do better work. And Brian has graciously agreed to join us today and talk about some of the systems that he works on for content creation. Right? This is kind of the first piece of this puzzle is how is content being created for the home, right? This is a question that comes up over and over again is we can make any type of system that we want at home in our media rooms and to our heart's desire. But really the first piece of this puzzle is how's the content being created? And so today we're going to focus on cinematic content creation for the home. And Brian, welcome. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, good morning. Hello.
Nice.
I believe I've successfully unmuted myself, so that's a solid start.
I can hear you. Hopefully everyone else can as well. Brian, just really quickly, you wear so many hats in this industry and in this world that it's interesting to try and keep up. And we've bullet pointed a couple of them here, specifically around your responsibilities at Skywalker Sound. Do you want to take a second just to kind of give us an overview of what you do?
Sure. So, we've thrown out some of the more interesting bullet points of what I do. And, as a systems engineer and a supervising engineer, a lot of that is engineering. There's some bureaucratic stuff and personnel management, of course, as well. But primarily, the role is, designing and keeping the infrastructure at the facility and kind of across Lucasfilm with regards to audio up to date, moving forward. And that's, that encompasses the full scope of design work all the way through the day-to-day maintenance. And we're a pretty small agile group, which makes us responsible for everything. It's not really compartmentalized. So there's a lot of cross-platform and cross-technology work. So everybody, even though we have our own little specialties, we kind of cross-pollinate a lot. So I deal with primarily loudspeakers and obviously the acoustics of that, advanced multi-channel sound, and the variable architecture DSPs that underlie that from various manufacturers and whatnot. and the extension of that is into remote collaboration. So Skywalker is a facility. We're based Northern California. Lucasfilm is global, and so we have to have global outreach to our clients, particularly in this day and age. So we've always had a strong program for remote collaboration, being able to get our content. And essentially, for a very simple analogy is, we kind of have our own version of Netflix, and that version of Netflix has a number of levels of quality, but at the end of the day, using a number of different transport mechanisms and technologies, we can pretty much get content to anybody on the planet, from regardless of internet connection. And of course, the end user connection depends on whether it's 2-channel compressed picture, but we can go all the way up to uncompressed picture and 16 channels of audio. So that's kind of fun. Some days it's being a telephone operator, and then as Miles mentioned, here, who's a send, who's a receive, and you patch that in essentially. And there's a lot of IT in it, and that IT work is challenging. And we're fortunate that we have a really good IT department that's really adapted to production infrastructure, and that's super important to have to make all that happen.
That's great.
And then out in the real world, it's important as a group to, participate. And so I was, I guess, voluntold after years of work into co-chairing the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, 25 CSS Cinema Sound Systems Committee, and that deals with sound for digital cinema. And it has a sister committee, 20F30, and that is primarily film-based audio. So between the two, which I also participate in, and then I work, I'm on various AES committees and whatnot too. So we can all kind of keep on the same page and keep moving forward.
So what you're saying is you have a lot of free time every day, right?
Yeah, totally. How many Zoom
great.
meetings will there be today,
Yeah. Oh, the new world, right? It's always interesting. But, I think the point about remote collaboration is really interesting, because that's something that you guys, and you specifically, have been doing for a while. And, of course, that's extremely relevant to today, is to make sure that, people get in front of that content and work together, as groups. It's nice to hear that infrastructure is in place and working well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other webinar, but, really, the roots of that started years and years ago, and it's just progressing to a time where now it's pretty much ubiquitous, and it has to be these days. So it's good that
Nice.
We've been at it for so long. The pivot to what we've had to do in the last couple of months wasn't actually that hard.
That's great. That's great. Well, just really quickly before we move on, I think a lot of folks that are logging into this conversation know who I am, or if you've reached out to Meyer Sound, we've talked at some point. I wear, several hats throughout Meyer, and just, my background is, I'm really working on building this program, the cinema program at Meyer Sound, that, Brian Long and even Steve Schertz were instrumental in, going back into, the 2012, 2011. It's when did you make your transition out to Skywalker?
Yeah. Here's the dark secret, everybody. Yes, I used to work for Meyer Sound. In 2011, I went from Meyer out to Skywalker.
Yeah, and so on that foundation, we've been able to build this really exciting program through Meyer Sound, where we've got a very diverse range of products, and it provides an opportunity to be on the front lines of what's happening in the industry. Thus, exciting conversations like this with Brian, and then I also get into system design and system calibration sides of things. So I have my head kind of wrapped around the whole project and implementation of cinema sound systems. So that's the foundation and the context of our conversation today. Brian, I was hoping that you could really quickly just continue the conversation around, all of the things that you do at Skywalker Sound, because, it's near impossible for me to keep track of all the projects and cool stuff that you do.
Sure. So, at the end of the day, we're creating content, and it's not that content that we create, even though it's movie content, for lack of a better term, that content proliferates and goes through, many various forms of media, and there's various tie-ins. So, we have the slide down there of, the movie theater, that's the bread and butter of what we do. Skywalker also has a full recording studio. So we're, recording scores, we're recording various music performances in, very basic formats all the way up to advanced multi-channel Atmos or 3D. And then, that content, I'll save one of the pictures for last, but that content goes out in the world. So we constantly lend our expertise to our friends and our clients, to go out and do massive multi-channel systems in 3,000 or more seat theaters or arenas or whatnot, to make sure that content is presented as best it can be in those environments. So that upper left photo is a picture of that's, I believe, Lion. Yeah, that's Lion LCRs and 3D subs in a 3,000 seat Art Deco theater for a premiere that we do for some friends and clients of ours on a regular basis. And then, we'll do off-ended technology testing and listening sessions and evaluation. So, you can kind of pick out some blue horns there, set up in an Atmos configuration, to do fun stuff, to check stuff out, to, orient our staff and people to kind of what's out there. And then on the upper right is, we do a lot of theme park rides, we do exhibits, we do one-off, just little spectaculars and shows. So this is a mock-up of a single one-off event that, this great scoring stage that we have has the space to do this. And then down on the right, the engineering staff also helps create content and provide creative solutions for making those signature sounds that are so well known out in the industry. And so this is one of them, and it's kind of a little trick system. We wanted a cone-centric speaker for something, but we wanted a lot of low frequency power behind it. So that's a little MM4, and it is time delayed and backed up into that X400. And yeah, it was kind of fantastic and a lot of fun to mess around with and put stuff through and re-record, make what we needed to make.
That's great.
So,
yeah,
and then all that stuff shows up in movies and makes it eventually to your home theater, or the headphones on your head.
Excellent. Yeah, that's and this is, of course, just a small little peek into the world of Skywalker sound. That's all right. Well, so let's kind of get into the meat of today's conversation, right? I mean, this is something that I find extremely interesting, and a lot of people have questions about this, and it's not a simple answer really, but the thought is, what's happening with cinematic content, right? The sound mix specifically, right? Are we getting that theatrical sound mix to the home entertainment release? Is that just a direct pass-through, or is there actually work being done to focus the content more towards the near field, midfield environment?
So yeah, I mean, the content itself is going to have many lives, and we as content creators recognize that those many lives are going to go through many forms. So just like when you're designing a system, it's okay, well, what are you targeting primarily, and then where are you going through the chain in the life of that content? So as that content exists, it is adapted from the large format mix down to more constrained mixes as you go through the chain. And that is done in situ. So you are doing it in environments that reflect the environments that they're going to be played out in. So, of course, primarily and for, recent history, it's been the theatrical exhibition is the king. Theatrical is where it started. That's where the directors, the content creators themselves are focused, is presenting their content in a large format room and in a large format environment. And that's what takes priority. So that's why movies are mixed in large rooms, played out in large rooms, and why we have the whole dubbing stage scenario. So the question, of course, is, the design considerations of there versus a small space where you don't have as many seats, you don't have the seating area, the numbers to provide coverage. And Meyer is really good in engineering, through Map Online and whatnot, is, you design systems for coverage and design systems for even coverage of your audience. So you got to evaluate what your audience is. And we as content creators need to keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to start in these big rooms, and then we're going to transition through various smaller rooms. And along the way, as we go down towards from theatrical to home to disc-based release to streaming content and whatnot, some of those platforms put different sets of criteria on us for how loud things can be. The streaming services have various metrics and whatnot for dialogue level, average loudness level, for various reasons, for their own continuity and content that we have to adhere to as well. So the theatrical mix is kind of the purest, most unbridled, it works within that full framework that's set out by various SMPTE standards and whatnot that the content creators can take advantage of. And then, we push down into the smaller environments.
Yeah, well, and you bring up a really good point is that, content isn't just being delivered to the home on optical media, right? There are other services where you can either download high resolution film content, and then of course streaming, which, the quality of streaming has evolved substantially over the years, right? And we're in a very exciting moment where there's a lot of really compelling regional relevant content available from streaming services.
Yeah, and that's for sure. And the thing with the streaming services too is they know they're playing to a highly variable audience. So within the streaming content prep, and a lot of that's handled by automated backend processes. When you connect through your iPhone on a lower quality connection, you're actually getting something different at a different bit rate than you do if you're sitting there unbridled and paid for the full Netflix HDR package, whatnot.
Yeah, so let's concentrate our conversation really on the full tilt boogie private cinema application, right? Or the advanced media room application where you're really considering an immersive sound format and you're saying, hey, I want to set up my room, but what do I need to set up, right? How is this content actually coming in? I mean, how many channels am I getting? There's all these really interesting questions about how that content is being created and what speakers need to go where, what kind of headroom requirements, all this stuff, right? And that is the focus of our conversation today. This next slide, really what we're looking at here is an ITU 7.1 implementation for a near field layout, right? And this is, and now correct me if I'm wrong, right, Brian, this is where most content was created for the home entertainment markets for quite some time. It was always done in a room very similar to this implementation.
Sure, and that implementation is based on various standards and layouts for optimal, speaker placement to get imaging, around the surround field. And it was an agreement between the majors that's existed for a number of years to work in a small point source environment, recognizing that, home theater, you're going to be sitting closer to the speakers, you're going to have fewer viewing spots, and, there's a difference, of course, between your average home theater versus the top 1% of home theaters as well. So the decision was made to primarily mix home theater in a room like this. And you're going to use a high quality two-way loudspeaker transducer that can handle dynamic range, that can handle the output, just so you can get that good reflection of, okay, well, if you do have a high quality small environment single listening position, this is what it is basically.
It's going to be an accurate representation of how your customer is going to hear your mix.
Right. So
ideally,
and that's not to say that there are a couple, and we're going to kind of get to that, is, this is kind of the general agreement. There are definitely facilities and methodologies that are used out in the rest of the world where they may mix or adapt in a bigger room, or they may mix TV in a bigger room. But they'll pull it down to a smaller set to check and be sure that what they are preparing for maybe the top 1% is also going to translate to the other, the vast majority. And there's a lot of considerations in doing this, and we'll probably touch on this at least once more as we go through. But, when you look at that big room, you see all these speakers everywhere, and then you look here and you see just a few speakers. And so, okay, well, why? And the answer to that is coverage. When you build a surround field for, the cinema or whatnot, all those speakers on the wall are known as what's called a diffuse array. So in a typical 5.1, 7.1 layout, that channel, that surround channel plays through multiple speakers. And as we know, when you have multiple speakers playing the same content at the same time, you get a slightly different feel than if you have a single point source speaker doing that.
Right.
So as we move from the larger environment to the smaller environment, it's important to really note the ramifications of that. And there's a lot of perceptual differences moving to the near field environment. And that's, even in the industry, with all the research that's been done and all the papers that have been written and the standards as they exist now, it's hotly debated, what those differences are and what your reference level should be and what, your EQ curve is between the large room and the small room. And that's, ongoing research as tools have advanced and things have allowed us to really kind of delve into the nuances behind the mechanics and the mechanical presentation of the content.
Right. And of course, this system, while certainly still in deployment in many facilities, has evolved into now what I'm showing on this next slide, which is a very common setup, right? Which is now we get into this momentum to say, yes, we've been in a 5.1, 7.1 surround world for a long time, and that's worked really well. But what's new and what's happening now is this push, this move towards immersive, right? And immersive is a really interesting, has been a really interesting path, as we've watched the evolution of the different formats moving forward. And we're in kind of a nice little sweet spot right now, the way I see it, in that there seems to be a lot of agreement around, the very base level immersive setup being a 7.1.4 implementation. And I guess maybe my question to you, Brian, is, how are you setting up your immersive rooms in your facilities? Are you going more towards a 7.1.4, or are there considerations where you're looking towards, larger implementations like the 9.1.6, which would be the maximum channel count available?
It's interesting in looking at the evolution of, kind of advanced multi-channel technology, in that, there's the ideal way of doing it, and certain manufacturers have, chosen different avenues to do it. But the reality is, you're looking at adapting this technology into existing rooms. So, there's considerations, and as you turn, what were point source or, standard 5.1, 7.1 rooms into, Atmos or Oro 3D or whatever, you have considerations to deal with. Certainly when you're out in the marketplace, you have, maybe more of the luxury of new build, which is great. But at the end of the day, the room implementations are going to vary a little bit. And it's been interesting too, as you watch the product manufacturers roll out their recommendations and specifications, where you get, okay, direct overheads versus bound ceiling speakers or whatnot. That adds variability and uncertainty to the mix. So what everybody's done, at least in content creation, that I'm aware of, and I'm sure there's some outliers that I'm not aware of there, is pretty much what's on screen now in an ideal circumstance for the home theater. Is, you're going point source, you're going with, the 0.4 and the 0.6 above, the primary listening position. And you're maintaining those angles. Those angles are crucial to spatialization. And the hard part about those overheads is that angle of separation, and where that really works for your head and where it really starts to fall off. And those, there's a ton of research on that. There's a ton of papers. We could spend, a lot of time in math and boring angles kind of drawing them out. But, for intents and purposes of this overview conversation, we won't. And then, you put that into a large room, and then the large room doesn't have this sort of angle, because the angles are so great, it's more of a direct overhead array. So this also gets more interesting when you bring the concept of music mixing into the fold, where music mixing is always done in a small room and almost always done in a point source. So as people are designing rooms on the consumer side for media, you almost have to decide. Yes, I mean, you can design a multi-purpose room for everything, but as a listener, you gotta kind of make a decision on what your preference is and what you really want to highlight in content, because that's going to choose you to make some different transducer decisions and some different angular decisions. And we'll kind of look at that probably in a couple of slides.
Yeah, well, you know, and I think a big thing to point out right now is headroom considerations, right? You know, we'll get into that as we throughout our conversation today, but you know, I'm showing in these last two slides, you know, a near field 7.1 to a near field 7.14, you know, and if we're designing those 7.14 around the Dolby Atmos specification, you know, they're very conscientious of your headroom requirements to make sure that those loudspeakers that you deploy in your setup will scale throughout the required headroom. You know, and of course, you know, from a Meyer sound standpoint, that is a huge conversation that we get into where, you know, even with Merlijn, you know, and his work with AES and Roger Schwenke and John Meyer, you know, there's all this conversation around tools and the ability for not just us as a manufacturer, but also for the consumer and the system specifiers to be able to validate that headroom performance of their loudspeaker systems. Because, you know, I think it's something that we keep saying, but really what we're getting into is translation, right? I mean, that is the key. I mean, it's the dragon we're tracing, right? You know, we are trying to produce content in a way that the consumer can have that experience and, you know, ultimately have that same emotional experience with that film or that music. You know, so
you know, actually on that point, you know, so yeah, the theoretical ideal of any advanced multi-channel format is you're going to have the exact same type of transducer with the exact same type of headroom, full range frequency response at every point in the listening space. So you have the same capability to, you know, pan your material through, separate it through and whatnot. And of course, the reality of that from, you know, physical structure of ceiling voids, you know, going into existing rooms, you know, aesthetics, you know, ceiling height available, is that's just really outside of a laboratory environment, I've never seen it. I've seen close to it. So that's why, you know, within system alignment and things like that, that's where things like bass management come into play, and other portions of tuning to make sure you get that frequency response. And, you know, it's important to have, especially in the surrounds and those smaller transducers, you still have to put a lot of dynamic range through them. So you can't, you know, you can't cheap out on the overheads, and you got to make sure you have, you know, your right density, right coverage pattern of those overheads coming down. And we've seen it, you know, you look across not only Meyer Sound, but all the other speaker manufacturers, and the evolution of product for, you know, professional install and home install and whatnot is, it's certainly definitely been a drawing board approach, because even as, you know, the technology and the implementation tools have increased, so has the artistic use of the technology.
yeah,
You know, it's funny because within the ability, one of the things that was realized kind of early on is, you know, within Atmos and Oro and whatnot, is you had the ability to, you know, suddenly move the music off the screen and, you know, separate it out onto the proscenium arch. And this created kind of a whole new aesthetic creative point in mixing. And, you know, it frees up your screen channels and, you know, what you're able to draw focus on the screen and how you're able to surround and envelop. And I'm sure you're going to have, you know, some folks more qualified than me to talk about that later in your web series. But, you know, the thing is you look at that and you compare that to kind of what Broadway's done for years, and other theatrical productions, and separating that A and that B system. You know, we saw it in Broadway, you know, decades ago. And then, you know, we've seen it live sound too, you know, doing your A and your B system, and, you know, surrounding your proscenium arch, or creating the ability to separate out dynamic events and create basically a bigger palette to paint on. And that's the novelty of all this, is so those things like when you're doing, you know, an advanced multi-channel format, those initial overheads or those initial surrounds that surround the screen, or those wides or whatnot, you know, they're, particularly in the professional implementations, they're critically important, because they need to be just as powerful. And then you look at what happens when you get off to the home environment. And, you know, you mentioned that the most popular implementation is 7.14. Wading into the home environment of the content preparation has been, it's been an experimentation of seeing what the AVRs do with your object data and where it's panned and how it's panned. And that's led to different clients wanting different implementations.
Yeah.
As far as people, and it comes down to the most common denominators. So when you look at the take rate of, Atmos or Oro or whatever to, 7.1, and then, your configurations, it's, how many have, a 7.14, how many have a 7.16 or a 9.16. So where do you want to make your content? And we certainly have the capability to do all of that, but we rely on our content creators to make that final call on whether, particularly to the home product is 7.14 or 9.16 or what have you.
Right. So I have a personal preference question for you. Maybe, feel free to say skip, but, in these types of rooms, something that comes up often is around surround based management, right? We are setting up these spaces so that all of the surrounds are expected to have the same spectral coverage or frequency response as the screen channels, right? And the way we can achieve that is either a full range loudspeaker, which maybe in some cases is the same size or the same loudspeaker as what's used for the screen channels. But more often than not, we're seeing, smaller, more practical to implement loudspeakers that are used in conjunction with subwoofers for bass management to give that, maybe from 80 hertz down to 40 hertz. So it has that same frequency extension. And the question is whether you put those surround bass management subs in your room and towards the back of the room, or if you have a preference to use the LFE array for that. Any thoughts there?
So yes, the history of bass management goes back to the LTRT days and the 5.1 days, and THX, of course, really promoted that. And there's, Tom Holman's books have a lot of good references to kind of the history of bass management and why. Full range, all channels has always been the goal and the ideal of the cinema, and it's always been recognized that surrounds have been, essentially limited because of where you can put them and various other things. So, that continues to carry forth in, what architecture is available, and then you get into the science of LFE. And how do you deal with long wavelengths and spaces, and where do you do that? What content, when it's put in a source, is activating that space for LFE, and how does the directional perception of LFE and across that crossover point work? Looking at what everybody does, and Meyer's been really good about it with cardioid subs and directional subarrays and things like that, is it's managing wavefronts and where you want those wavefronts to emulate from, really. And of course, then what happens with the structure if you're in a basement below grade. So the answer to bass management is it is a very complex question that really requires a thorough analysis. That said, we will provide, and I like it as well, is, we're essentially quad bass managing, so the LFE is the LFE, our screen channels are full range screen channels, but the surround fields are going to bass manage to a sub local to them. So the sidewalls are going to bass manage to, a sidewall sub on each sidewall. The backs are going to bass manage to a sub, respective. Left back has its own section, has its own sub, right back has its own section sub, and that's in a professional environment. So, you look at the geometry of your space, what you have available, and, certainly without, going into a lot of technical nuance. And, Dolby allows for it in the processors and whatnot. If your processor allows for it, but see, if you look at a home AVR, they're only going to give you, it's going to be like an 11.12 or something like that, or 13.2. And they're planning on you having those subs probably at the front of the room. They don't allow you really that DSP control separation to put subs in the back for bass management.
Well, and you bring up,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but you bring up a really good point, which is, the tools that are deployed in the consumer or residential space are different tools than are deployed in the content creation space. And the AVR is kind of that bridge in between. And based on, you know, what feature set is available from the AVR that's used in your deployment at home, you know, you have different flexibility to interpret where and how you want to place loudspeakers and go down this path of base management, or, you know, just full range extension to your surrounds.
And certainly the AVR, you know, in certain environments, because we have them in our environment, and, you know, our wider corporate environment too, is, you know, you're going to go into boardrooms, you're going to go into review rooms, you're going to go into things like that are not, you know, a full professional room. They don't have, you know, rendering mastering units, they don't have these cinema servers, you're playing out content, you're checking out content, but you still may, you know, also want to pass content from a streaming server. You may want to look at it, and you may want to call up Netflix and go, hey, okay, well, how does this piece play on Netflix? How does this piece play on Amazon Prime? How does it play on D+? So, you know, you're going to pull through that consumer chain. And so then the question is how do you implement? You can certainly, you know, through some trickery within the you know, AVR, declare everything is, you know, full range channel, and then pass it out to, you know, for what you guys would be a Galaxy or a processor or whatnot, and then do your base management processing and, you know, actual system alignment on the back end with a higher level of capability. So,
right.
You know, it depends where you're after. So, you know, so I guess I should quantify professional, you know, when we're creating that top tier, you know, content for theatrical, that's when we're doing the distributed subs for base management and surround. When we are in the home theater and the smaller environment content creation, we are checking that against a single base managed through the LFE.
Nice. Well, and to your point, this is system design is hand in hand with room design and implementation, right? You know, it's I'm sorry to say it, but even the best loudspeaker system can't make a terrible room perform well, you know, and so it's really, you know, I'd say it time and time again, but it's so important to get the room right. And when you've got the room right and the system designed together, you know, you really find that implementation that works best. And you know, that's the quickest answer of why it's not just a here's the stamp and what you do in every room. Every room is an evaluation of what that system needs to be to give you the best performance. And which, you know, and actually leading into our next, you know, slide here, it gets into these interesting spaces, right? These hybrid production spaces, which actually, you know, this room implementation is on par with some of even the private cinema implementations and deployments that we see, right? Where you've got a split system that can have a full DCI, you know, playback chain and the home entertainment playback chain, and you have to use, you know, find the way for that room to be a hybrid of both and be effective.
Yeah, so I'm gonna jump back kind of a topic, and then, you know, this room is very interesting as far as where the world is going. So in a couple of fronts. So, you know, the room, I mean, what you said about the room is the most important part. You know, if you have a room that is acoustically poor, or, you know, puts your null and your bass response at the wrong location, you're game over. There's no amount of EQ that's going to fix that. And I see so many times that people will try and fix with equalization. And, you know, you look at these settings and come in, and it's horrendous. There'll be, you know, all these notches and dips, and, you know, it's the phase damage that does to the signal. It doesn't work out. Your room has to be right. And, you know, the ideal for us, and even in SMPTE, when we went through and wrote RP 2096-1 and -2, we really had a lot of discussions, and this is, you know, industry discussions on EQ and over EQ and what is appropriate and whatnot, and kind of wrote that wording to guide people to be sure your room is right, so you don't have to fix it electronically at the end, you know, because
fix it.
Yeah, exactly. So that soapbox aside, back to this kind of sort of room is interesting in that, you know, you have so much content now that the world's beginning to shift. the amount of content that's being made for the various streaming platforms is massive. And, you know, those streaming platforms are beginning to invest in a lot of high dollar content. With that high dollar content is going to come, you know, those same industry teams who are very used to these big room mixes. And, you know, this is actually, you know, this is a nice moderate size room that you have on screen. But even that can be small for some of these productions that have a lot of stakeholders. So you're then stuck with, okay, well, all these stakeholders want to be in the room one way or another, and they need to make comments. And especially in this era of social distancing, we can't, even if it is a small room mix, we can't, you know, comply to local guidelines and whatnot and stay operating and have content holders in the room. So we're forced to, you know, whether social distancing or not, because if there wasn't, there would want to be a lot more people in the room. And these mixes are just as intricate. They require the same amount of hardware. You know, the mixers are going to want the same level of faders and stuff like that that they're used to having on a big mix, because that's what's happening. It's just that the content outlet is different. So you're looking at taking advantage of, you know, midfield rooms like this, or taking your larger rooms and modifying them to be midfield, and looking at your surround arrangements in there and coming up with, you know, point source coverage for a small format so it more mimics what actually ends up being some of these ultra high-end home theaters. You know, these ultra high-end home theaters are actually positioned in kind of an ideal state for high-end content that's coming from you know, streaming services in particular, because it's done with a smaller environment being the primary. You know, instead of, you know, creating for the large room, they're creating for the small room, and that's their primary focus. That's where they really want the content to shine. And yeah, they may do a theatrical mix later, but now we're seeing that that theatrical mix may just be a 5:1 mix, you know? So it's an interesting change to the industry that we're navigating through and working through methodologies to make sure that what we intend is what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from what I'm seeing and having conversations, oftentimes the middleman between, you know, the format creators and the studio implementation is, you know, what room is too big for home entertainment and too small for theatrical, and there's no real hard set of rules, and you know, this is where you know, it gets, you know, the fun kind of comes back into the project, because we're really looking at the performance of that system, you know, and from a sound perspective, you know, it's we are designing those systems in this type of room so that it meets the full theatrical headroom requirement, right? You know,
Right.
and in that way, we know that it will scale into the home entertainment of the point source 9.1 implementation of a room like this as well, and cover that headroom. And we'll have successful, again, back to our favorite word, translation, where we know that that will translate up to the big room and down to the small room. And you know, it's really just trying to find that sweet spot. But this size room is something that we are seeing, you know, common, you know, pretty common popping up in content creation side of things. And it really is on par with that, like you say, you know, the high-end private cinema rooms, the 1% of the 1% of these fun spaces. But it's important, you know, because again, this, you know, the way that content is created, it's created with the thought that it could be listened back in a room like this, right? You know, it could be,
Not it could, it will, you know, it will.
right? You know, which is, you know, that's there. It's not a corner cutting position. It's not throwing it to the last stage. It's saying this is important, and we want to make sure that we have this high quality presentation to our customers. It's nice. Well, let's keep moving here. We're kind of getting into a little bit of the meat of this conversation, right? You know, we get
now
into,
we're into the details. We brought out the charts.
oh geez, that's you know, so let's just skip this one and move to the fun stuff, right? No, I'm just kidding. This is actually,
this
you
is
know,
the fun stuff.
you know how I know you're a nerd? Anyway.
Right.
So you know, let's talk about the standards that we see in play for the calibration of the rooms, and let's also talk about the headroom requirements, because this is a place where There's a lot of interpretation, and it's challenging for again, for dealers and consumers to navigate the data that is presented on sound systems, right? We in a lot of ways live in a world where the biggest number that you can put on a data sheet is the best, but then you bring that into practical reality and you say, well, wait, what's happening here? What am I actually getting? And so we have, really what we're looking at is a set of goals and criteria for how we design systems to say, hey, let's make sure that we have that headroom available to us. These particular charts are something that we use at Meyer Sound on every cinematic design and evaluation. And they're, at least the right side of the screen, that's all based around a reference level of 85 dBSPL per screen channel. But looking at the left side of the screen, what I see here is that there's some places, specifically in content creation, where we might use different reference levels. So can you talk to this about the standards that are in play and the reference levels for the different size rooms you have?
Certainly. So now we get into these numbers, and these numbers are the fundamental. I mean, these are the building blocks. Is these standards detail, how speakers are laid out. So when you look at 202M, 202M is the theatrical standard for room response, and it's known as the X curve. There's a lot of debate surrounding the X curve and how it came to be. Myself and Roger Schwenke and a team of people wrote kind of the most recent investigation in that, and kind of showed the interaction of what happens when you put a horn behind a loudspeaker screen, which combined with other people's research and efforts, paints that whole picture. But at the end of the day, when you go into a very large room, there is a roll-off of high frequency on the loudspeakers, primarily, attributed to the screen and loudspeaker interaction and complex comb filtering. And so, that's your far field, and the technological reason for that existing and continuing to exist is still for debate. And that is a path that is moving forward, and it's a conversation in the industry. It's for sure. Will it ever change? Who knows? But we're going to go from that. But that's your starting point. And so certainly when we make this transition into the small rooms in the home theaters, you're not doing that because near field speakers don't require the X curve. Near fields are flat, or flat-ish. Just the actual roll off of them. There will be some just for natural air attenuation, and depending on what you do. But all that to say is, when you're in the near field is designed to be flat-ish. It doesn't have that standardized roll off, and that's what SMPTE 222M reflects that near field roll off curve. And that curve is echoed then in ATSC 85, which is the broadcast standard for mixing and whatnot as well. So within that, you also have, the industry has set reference level, to have consistent playback conditions for loudness between there. And there, of course, is another whole debate going on out there about loudness in exhibition and this, that, and the other thing. And is the framework appropriate? Does it allow, things that are appropriate? Is it people are abusing it? And if you look market to market, that's a whole other very long webinar on its own. But at the end of the day, there is a standard for pink noise, which is SMPTE 2095-1, which equates to the Dolby pink noise, which has been the industry standard, if you will, for years and years and years. And you use that to set a reference level. And that reference level is, and when you say -20 pink, you would think that is 20 dB of headroom. But when you look at pink noise, the actual headroom to 0 dBFS isn't 20 dB. But that doesn't mean, depending on your sound, what you're putting out, narrow bandwidth versus wide bandwidth, there's different considerations. So at the end of the day, 85 dBc was decided upon to be the reference level of -20 pink at the theatrical level. And so throughout the years, people have, and looking at near field, well, if you play something at 85 and you're sitting 2 meters from it, the perceptual loudness may seem a lot louder than if it was in the far field. So over the years in the standards, again, refer to ATSC 85, RP200 and whatnot, going through there, it gives a chain at what the industry has arrived at for reference levels. So you're, at the end of the day, your theatrical content is going to go ahead and be mixed at 85. And when you come into the home theater, that's another thing that is going to happen at the home level, is you're going to drop that reference level to 80 dBc approximately. Broadcast will sometimes use 79, and then you're subject to what is known as volume and dialogue normalization to carry your content through there. When you get down, an optical disc media is pretty cool in that it generally doesn't come with constraints that the streaming services do, but the streaming services are going to come with a target dialogue, essentially reference level, which is done through metering. It's not, if I tell you minus 27 OKFS, nobody's going to know what that actually means. So but that content, even though it's constrained for loudness and peaks are ensured to be held depending on what the content provider has specified, is done at that reference level of around 80 dB.
Well, and
so you have to accommodate.
Just to interject, the 85 in a theatrical context is, that's set around a really dynamic piece of content. If you think about cinematic content, it gets very intimate at times, and it just, goes through the roof because you have these really exciting theatrical presentation, big sound systems deployed, right? And as you bring that into your home entertainment mix, right? Not only are you using maybe a lower reference level because you're now more in the near field of that loudspeaker, but you're also seeing that the dynamic range will change a bit in that content output.
Well, and not only do you have, a high-powered sound system, but you're in a room which is, reasonably noise isolated. There's an expectation that you can play dynamic content in it. And that's what the cinema reference level is for, is to give you this dynamic range to use. And, directors and content creators will use it differently. They will certainly use it, maybe to be on the softer side. Admittedly, that is probably the lesser of the uses. More often than not, you're going to be treated to bombastic. But that's also the debate in the industry regarding loudness is, we've given them this framework to use it. Are people supposed to be penalized because people are using it loudly, but not all content does it that way? So is it about preserving the window, or is it about, constraining it? And so, moving to the home market, you don't have those same expectations necessarily. That it's a different set of listening considerations, and that, it's not in great majority of the cases, you're not going to be able to say, oh, well, I have this environment where I can play back this hugely dynamic content, or, it's going to be at reference level. There is within the home environment, everybody has access to the volume knob. So, you got to deal with that in your constraints.
Right.
But at the beginning of the day, we looked at content preparation, and we looked at content, and, back at, with Steve Schertz and those guys at, and John Meyer, particularly at the beginning of the cinema effort was, how do we produce really linear content? And how do we make sure that at the top of the chain, we have that, that we're not limiting at all? What's the standard? What do we write? And so that's where these tables became important, was looking at that and kind of analyzing the different possibilities and whatnot. So at the end of the day, from your screen channels to your surrounds, you got to make sure that you're maintaining these level of peak headrooms, because the content will do it, So.
That's right. Well, and certainly from, a design perspective, a Meyer sound design perspective, we design every system to maintain that headroom, that we kind of generally call the 20 dB of headroom for cinematic content above your reference level. And that's where this conversation of what is your reference level is important, right? Because, again, thinking about the home system, right? It's like, well, if we're never going to be living or listening at 85 dB SPL, but we design to the headroom requirements above 85 dB SPL, maybe there there is you know, more there to that system than is needed. And so you really want to have your customer or your dealer know what the listening environment is aimed for, so that we can design the system specifically, again, for that customer's needs. You know, and then, you know, also if there's going to be a music aspect to that, right, which is, again, this is where these rooms get so interesting, is that it's not just about cinema anymore, and especially as we talk about immersive sound formats, right? It's not just cinema content, but it's also music content and gaming content that's all being, you know, consumed and played back in that one system. And from the consumer standpoint, they have a single deployment that is going to take care of all of their needs, right? And so we want to make sure to look at that and address that. And that's where all of this, you know, this data that we see on screen comes from, is to say, here's a framework of how the content is being created. Let's make sure that we design systems, whether it's for content creation or consumption, in line with those standards.
So yeah, and so, you know, that's, you know, those two things, music and video games, are you know, highly important. And so if we look at that, which are we next? Yeah, if we look at the next slide, is the next slide? Yes, there we go. So, you know, when you kind of look at the home environment, you kind of, versus music, you know, okay, well, you know, if you're focusing on movies, there's going to be a screen. You know, content is mixed with speakers behind the screen for a reason. And speakers, those left and right, should always be behind the screen. Otherwise, when people pan stuff or dialogue pans, it might end up with that dialogue or that effect going off screen and pulling your attention off screen rather than to the edge of the screen, or making the phantom image not land within the boundaries of the screen. So, you know, it's always interesting when you see the left and right outside beyond the bounds of the screen, because, you know, immediately you're kind of breaking the frame of the way content was created. Now, when you're, you know, point source and checking content for home, if you're, you know, because most people, you, me, you know, we've got a television, you know, and then we've got speakers just outside of the, you know, television. So that's one of the things that is looked at. Is if you do have, you know, speakers just at the edge of the screen or whatnot, that it's not too distracting, that, you know, you maintain the panning and whatnot across the speakers, so it translates to those that don't have the luxury of speakers behind the screen.
Right.
So the, you know, when you look at music, when you look at video games, those are primarily created in a point source surround environment. They don't use diffuse arrays. They don't focus on the big rooms. It's going to be a point source. And music is a lot of fun, because, you know, a lot of the music people are using, you know, particularly not necessarily the overheads, but the back and the side surrounds are going to have transducers that are, you know, fully capable of and may even be the same as the you know, the LCR, and the same in the video game surround systems too. But typically, you know, there's a smaller desktop system centered around a computer or whatnot. But the point is you have a more guarantee of equal transducers around, and the content people who are creating that content are aware of that. So the perspective of music is super cool in that, you know, depending on the perspective that the mixer or whatnot decides to put you in for that, they may, you know, push the orchestra out, put you in the center of the orchestra, or put, you know, just as intense stuff out in the surrounds as in the are in the main channels. So it's important to be aware of that if you're designing, or if you're looking at a system primarily for music or video games, that, you know, that's important.
That's right. Yeah. It turns out the content you want to play back and how you want to use your room is an important part of that design philosophy, right?
Right.
That's nice. You know, this is kind of just a really quick overview, as I see that we're kind of up against our conversation timeline here.
Sure.
You know, but again, this is you know, a lot of these graphics we've been showing are from our Map XT application, and this is how we can actually predict headroom and coverage of loudspeaker systems and deployments in rooms, so that, you know, we are not going into a room design guessing, right? And that's an important part, is to know where you stand, you know, with your headroom and coverage considerations.
Right, and so this particular room, in that guessing thing, is this is a smaller room, but the smaller room is focused on producing content for the larger room. So while the layout of the surrounds in here are fully capable of point source, it is capable of a diffuse array, so that you get that, that phasey mishmash that you do when you're using a diffuse array in a larger room. Even though it is, a single, listening position, they still wanted that, diffuse array to prep their content and be able to, experience that as close to the large room as they could.
Right.
So again, it's following the chain, what's important for your content.
Well, so important, right? And also, but there's also a personal taste of who's working in that room, right? And what they want.
For sure.
To. Nice. We've kind of been, this conversation could go on for hours and hours, Brian.
Yeah. Oh, it does.
And, it's a hard one to pack into a 1 hour conversation. This is really, I wanted to have this slide in here just to show, the different sizes of rooms where you might check content.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, the juxtaposition for sure. That's, where it starts in the big room on the left, and then, where one of those spaces where it's checked before it goes out and, adjusted, proofed before it goes out to consumers on the right,
All right, Brian, I'm sorry to rush you through that last one, but I just wanted to throw this slide really quickly. Here are some references for folks to follow up on. These are the standards that.
Yeah, so let's give a little breadcrumb clue here. So the ITU ones are speaker placement recommendations. ATSC 85 concerns broadcast standards, and the section on cinema includes, the reference curve and talks about reference level and whatnot. It's a really good compendium of knowledge in the standard suite. 222M is the call out for the small room calibration curve, and it talks about that. 202M is the large room calibration curve. RP200 is a reference level alignment. SMPTE 2095-1 I think is probably the most important, as that is the pink noise standard, and that standard comes with the pseudocode and whatnot for you to generate your own noise. So if there's one thing that's definitely takeaway is 2095-1 is the reference for calibrating systems, and then 2096-1, and there is also a 2096-2, are the practical procedural documents for commissioning and calibrating systems, larger format systems, but it certainly all applies to smaller room systems as well.
So we expect everyone on this meeting to read these documents and memorize them before our next web series, which that's Friday, so you got time. That's nice. Brian, thank you so much for your time today. This is, if one thing's clear, this is a very broad conversation, but this really is helpful to hear from the front lines, to hear what you guys are doing in content creation. And how we can design systems not only for your customers and help you do better work, but also continue that tool set and make it available to the consumer as well.
Yeah, so, I mean, at the end of the day, the content is only as good as it's received out there. So hopefully this is useful for those in the audience, and it is a very broad picture, but so I believe let's try that.
All right, Merlijn. Well. I can still barely hear you. All right. Well, Merlijn, that's the end of our conversation here. I hand it back to you to wrap up.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Brian. Are you open to questions? Are people allowed to ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely. People are allowed to ask questions. I think my AirPods batteries might hold out just a little bit longer.
Excellent. So to those that are joining us on Facebook, please post your questions in the comments of the stream, and then I will read them out loud, and then Miles, our host, and Brian, our guest lecturer, can answer that question to the best of their abilities. While you're doing this, I will start going back to the household notes, and I would like to point out that a recording of today's webinar will be available within the next couple of hours on our Thinking Sound YouTube channel. Meanwhile, I'd like to point out that next Monday, due to popular demand, we're going to do a live rerun of a previous webinar, which will be power scaling. So be sure to join us. And Miles, are you already in a position to mention something about Friday's webinar, or is it still very much work in progress?
No, Friday is another exciting conversation in that Jonathan Kamrava, Steve Starkweather, and Kat Rocks from our R&D group, our loudspeaker design group, have agreed to have a roundtable conversation with me, so we can talk about some of the things that go into consideration of loudspeaker design, the collaboration of the team, and just. We have a lot of factory tours at Meyer Sound where we invite our family in to see what we're up to. But if you're on a factory tour, you never get the opportunity to talk to the R&D team. We shuffle you right through that group real fast. And so here's an opportunity now to hear from some of those folks. And I'm looking forward to that conversation as well.
Me too. Very much looking forward to that. Well, from what I can tell, there are no questions popping up in the comments, which sounds like it's up to me.
Mission accomplished.
Mission
Sweet.
accomplished.
Everybody knows everything.
Mission accomplished, and motion to adjourn.
Brilliant.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
See you guys later.
Stay safe, stay healthy, everyone, and best to you and your loved ones. See you this Friday.
Brilliant.
Bye-bye.